Good morning. And Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it's good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 tents, or 3 shelters. Let's call one the Salvation Army Center of Hope. Let's call another one Alpha House. And let's call one the Calgary Drop-In Center." He was old and dirty and toothless. His beard was covered with snow. It was a brutal day in January a few years ago. The wind was howling outside. It was -18 at 3 in the afternoon. The place I was working at had an addictions program and several hundred shelter beds, and we were already over capacity. We had filled the chapel, we'd filled the gymnasium, and the foyer was full with extra mats and chairs for people. His name was Daryl. I'd seen him before, and when he came in this time, his face struck me. He looked so cold and so old, but with all the lines in his face, they told a story of a life of chaos and hardship. But it was a very kind face. I approached him and suggested that we get a coffee and we could find him a place where he could sit and be warm. He followed me into the dining area. Sitting across from me at the table, he held that cardboard cup as though it were bone china. I told him I was sorry, but we were full, and we'd called around, and all the other shelters were full too. I told him that we were out of mats. But in our conversation, he told me that he had been just exited from Simon House for sleeping past the wake-up time and for missing his chore. That was the first time I'd ever heard about Simon House. When I told him that he could stay in that chair for the night, what he said surprised me. "Foxes have holes, the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head, so I guess I'm in good company." He was my introduction to Simon House those many years ago. Never thinking that I would ever work there, I listened to Daryl's story that led him to where he was that day. He told me about his childhood sexual abuse, about physical abuse. He told me that he'd been drinking heavily since he was 8 years old. He told me about his first encounter with the law and with the police when he was 10. Then he told me that he went to a youth addiction program, and it was there that he said he found Jesus. He said that while that program didn't work for him, he went to university in London, Ontario, and took religious courses, and that was where he discovered the homeless Jesus. His university, by the way, in London, has a full bench with this homeless Jesus on it. At university, he told me, he met the most amazing woman ever. Her name was Sylvia, and they were married. They had 2 boys. But he told me that Sylvia had an affair, and then she died by suicide. He went into a deep depression and found a new love called cocaine. Soon he was homeless. He went to prison for drug crimes, and he was without a home, and he'd lost all hope. "You know," he said one day when we were chatting, "there's only 1 letter difference between hopeless and homeless. And if you take those letters and put them together, what do you get?" So me being a wisecracker, I said MP. And he said, "Absolutely right. And if you think about it, our MPs could solve this homeless problem, and they could bring hope to thousands." This year, Simon House is officially 40 years old. The history of the name is interesting. The project was the dream of Brother Bernie, a friar who's now buried at Mount St. Francis Retreat Center, where we were just on Friday ourselves. It's right near Cochrane. As Bernie was reflecting on homelessness and the addicted population in Calgary, he was reminded that, like Jesus, everyone has a cross to bear. If you read in Mark chapter 15, verse 21, you'll read the story of Simon of Cyrene, who was forced by the Roman soldiers to carry Jesus' cross. So Simon House is named after Jesus' cross-bearer. Over those 40 years, over 6,000 men have gone through our program. We're located in Bowness, and our 60-plus beds are almost always full. And today we have over 70 on our waiting list. Our program, our culture, all of our activities are focused on a lifetime of recovery and sobriety for our residents. While many of our residents come from poverty and can tell you trauma-ridden stories, we have residents from all walks of life. Our residents are just like your family members, just like your neighbors, just like your friends. Our program at Simon House is 12 weeks long. It begins with an orientation week, and then you enter 3 program phases, which we like to call be, belong, and become. In the first of those, the being phase, people deal with their past, discover who they were meant to be, and will begin to leave the past behind for a new and positive future. In the second, belonging phase, our residents learn how to make amends for past wrongs, rediscover their spirituality, reconnect with family and friends, and plan for positive future relationships. Finally, in the becoming phase, our residents work on strategies to keep them grounded, things like housing, employment, connection to our alumni association, and attending support groups. At Simon House, we talk a lot about family. We talk about being at Simon House is a new family. Anyone in the Simon House family is always welcome to return. It becomes home. And Kathy here says welcome home quite a bit when she sees people who are coming back. They can come back to Simon House anytime they need support, or sometimes they come back to offer support to a new resident. My friend Daryl was a really wise man. Believe it or not, even though I met him in a homeless shelter, he had 2 university degrees. He was extremely well read, but his past chaos had led him to alcohol and drugs. Like so many, he needed to find a way to mask the pain in his life that had started with the chaos of his childhood, from the trauma and from the negative life experiences. He chose alcohol and drugs, which left him without positive connections, without a home, and without hope. Broken relationships with God, with his family, and mostly with himself tormented his mind. But Daryl could quote Maya Angelou poems, and here's an excerpt from one of his famous ones. Lying thinking last night how to find my soul a home where water is not thirsty and bread is not stone. I came upon one thing, and I don't believe I'm wrong, that nobody, but nobody, can make it out there alone. Alone, all alone. Nobody, but nobody, can make it out here alone. What that poem captures for us is something we often say at Simon House. The opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connections. Only by connecting to your higher power, by connecting to positive family and community, by connecting to support groups, only then will you remain in recovery. Daryl was clean for several years and worked closely with the University of Calgary nursing and social work departments by volunteering to take students on nighttime homeless walks. I loved going with him because he knew the system and he knew hundreds of street people. He called them friends. What he gave to those students was immeasurable. Just as an aside, Daryl also had a great sense of humor. One time he told some students, I was really poor once. You want to know how poor I was? And of course, Marie says, how poor were you? And he says, I was so poor, I sold my TV to pay my cable bill. But Simon House reminds me of the scripture of the day. Simon House is like a shelter or a tent on a high mountain. We have residents who come, they get stable, and they join a recovery journey. And sometimes they just want to stay with us. But like the disciples, our residents need to come down from that mountain and enter the real world. When they enter that real world, they are changed. They are ready to deal with the pitfalls of life. They have their, what we call their addiction recovery toolkit. It's full of support literature. It's full of phone numbers to keep them secure on their new journey. I like social media. I especially watch LinkedIn and now X, used to be Twitter. The other day I saw a tweet about addiction, about poverty and homelessness. It was titled, Why Socks Aren't Enough. The attachment that I read was about who feels good when socks or a meal is given to someone who is homeless. And of course, it's the giver and also the receiver. Of course, people like Daryl need meals and socks, but meals and socks don't solve homelessness, and they certainly don't solve addiction. The article said that while you give a monetary support to someone, even though you feel good because you gave, they are still left in their predicament. And in the next few minutes, I'd like to look at a few things that we can do, which is what I would say is giving more than just socks or a meal. First, one thing the current provincial government is doing is adding several new treatment centers around the province. Some will be built on reserve, and I think this is very good. Second, churches can do what Wild Rose is doing by making social services, addiction services, your daycare center available in your facilities. This is a fabulous way to partner and to bring social services to your community. You need to be commended for this. Third, church members can volunteer. The words of Jesus in response to the lawyer who asked him, "Who is my neighbor?" is clear for us all. Jesus responded, "Your neighbor is anyone, anywhere who needs you." Awareness of a need demands a response, and as Jesus said to the lawyer, we are to go and do likewise. When we hear God's call, we must listen and we must respond. There are people in this church who have heard God's voice and have left here to minister in pulpits in countries around the world, in homelessness and in addiction agencies. There are people who have been and are members of this church, and many others who have become teachers, who've worked in homeless shelters, and people who have run for political office. There are churches who know that socks aren't enough, so they build homes. And I know a few churches that have built seniors and low-income housing on properties they hold in the city of Calgary. A fourth thing is doing care the same old way that we did it in the past doesn't always work. We need to constantly upgrade. At Simon House, we know that the punitive model of the past was only partially successful. Our new model is a model of love and care, and we use evidence-based research to design program, to develop a systems approach, and we know that that will build recovery capital for our residents. Fifth, we can all support a national drug strategy. What if we did that at the federal government level? Instead of rescue boats being built at the bottom of a waterfall, we need to go upstream and build railings to stop people from falling into the addiction river in the first place. Prevention works. but as I see it, there is no clear national prevention plan. An agenda that deals with trauma before it leads to someone needing to mask their pain with drugs and alcohol needs to be developed. It needs to be coordinated, and it needs to be of single focus. If this was done, we would not leave a single Canadian on the death row of addiction. 6, we could connect to the national drug strategy an idea of lobbying the government. Churches can do letter writing campaigns, and that can change the system. When I do a letter to the government, I don't always tell them what they're doing wrong. I often try to tell them what they're doing right, because they need to know when we like what they do. But Christian groups like Kairos and Citizens for Public Justice, they lead the way with this. They're always writing letter campaigns. 7, parishioners can volunteer together at homeless shelters and can work in organizations like the Children's Cottage or Trellis. Even our clients get involved by sorting toys at Christmas time with the Salvation Army toy program. 8, there are churches who've adopted a refugee family, and they make sure that they get the supports they need to acclimatize to Canada and to their new way of life. There's an organization called Bridges of Hope in the United States that's a model for this. And if you want to do something like that, you can Google Bridges of Hope and discover some good strategies. And 9, and finally, churches and church folk can pray for and support financially the work of social service agencies like Simon House, as we are the hands and feet of Jesus, working on his behalf for the clients we serve. Together we can join hands to become a mighty army lifting people out of despair and hope. What I find in this work, and in speaking with clients and with my friend Daryl, broken relationships abound. Our work is about restoring relationships, restoring your inner self, restoring connection to your divine power, restoring connections to family and to community. When Daryl was dying, my wife and I went several times to the Foothills Hospital to be with Daryl. On our last visit, he took a cardboard cup of coffee and we watched him hold it like it was bone china. After our visit, we said our goodbyes, and as Kim gave him a hug, he said, "When I die, I'd like to give God the names of everyone who helps street people. And I know there are a lot of people out there who really care." He closed his eyes, and the last words we heard him say were, "I love you guys." He was clean for several years. His life choices, which he used to mask his pain and trauma, finally ended his life, and he died the next day. I believe his homeless Jesus has welcomed him to his final shelter. And when he gives God those names, can he give God yours? Can he give God yours? Can he give God yours? God bless you all.